All right. If Clemens were here, he'd be very proud of us. Exactly on the hour. So good evening. My name is Mahan Mirza. I'm the executive director of All right. If Clemens were here, he'd be very proud of us.
Oh,
Exactly on the hour.
oh dear.
My voice returns. So good evening. My name is Mahan Mirza. I'm the executive director. All right. If Clemens were here, he'd be very proud of us.
Oh,
Exactly on the hour.
oh dear.
My voice returns. So good evening. My name is Mahan Mirza. I'm the executive director. All right. If Clemens were here, he'd be very proud of us.
Love technology.
Yes,
Don't you?
yes.
Okay.
It's because people don't usually listen to me, so the system has to repeat.
We call that nagging.
I'll I'll wait
Others
for your
perfected
signal.
it.
Are we good to go?
Mm.
All right. Well, good evening. If Clemens were here, he would be very.
Oh. There we go.
So I'm Mahan, the executive director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, part of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. Welcome to all of you who are here in person and to our viewers online. Tonight's program is part of this year's Notre Dame Forum on the Future of Democracy. Not all institutions in democracies are democratic, a prominent example being the military, with its strict hierarchy and chain of command. Nobody argues it should be more democratic, least of all the poet who penned the charge of the Light Brigade. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. How about an institution like the Catholic Church? Should the Catholic Church be more democratic? Can the ways of God, and should the ways of God, move with the times? And how so? These are some of the questions we hope to engage tonight. We've posed these questions mindful of Pope Francis's insight, expressed no less eloquently than Tennyson: we are not living in an era of change, but a change of era. A variety of terms have been used to signal this change of era, from Anthropocene to acceleration, an age in which humans will either become gods, Homo Deus, or become extinct. Just this week, we read two authors in my class on engaging world religions. One who ponders on the meaning of education in what he calls the age of collapse, Ahmed Afzal's Teaching at Twilight. The other, who happens to be in this room, believes we could be at the cusp of something new, something beautiful, a new stage in our collective evolution. We must, argues Thomas Legrand, reimagine and reinvent human institutions, local and global, for a new politics of being. There is a resonance emerging. I hear it with the Sikh author Valerie Kaur, who asks about the darkness all around us in society and politics. Is this the darkness of the tomb? Are we dying? Or is it the darkness of the womb? Are we giving birth to new life? Instead of total darkness, Ahmed Afzal prefers the metaphor of twilight. In its literal sense, he writes, twilight signifies the illumination of the atmosphere while the sun is below the horizon, a phenomenon that happens twice in a 24-hour period, between dawn and sunrise, morning twilight, and between sunset and dusk, evening twilight. Twilight can therefore signify both a beginning and an ending. Even the evening twilight need not be associated with the end. In the Jewish and Islamic reckoning, for example, the day begins at sunset rather at sunrise. Metaphorically, twilight is best understood as the ambiguous interval between two unmistakably different objects of experience, daytime and nighttime. As such, the word can also suggest an undefined intermediate or in-between state, or a period of rapid transformation from one state to another, end quote. A change of era. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers to address tonight's topic on the Catholic Church and democracy in a change of era. It is impossible to conceive of a better person to guide us through the ambivalence of twilight than the author of The Ambivalence of the Sacred. Founding dean of the Keough School, holder of 5 honorary doctorates, and pioneer in the field of global engagement with religion, Scott Appleby. He is joined by world-renowned historian of global Catholicism, provost and chief academic officer at the University of Notre Dame, John McGreevy, and by our special guest of honor, former President of Ireland, who holds a doctorate in canon law, and most importantly, is the chair of the Ansari Institute's advisory board, Mary McAleese. I will return later to thank the many co-sponsors for tonight's program and to say a few words about the next 2 very exciting days at the Ansari Institute. Now, please join me in welcoming Doctors Appleby, McGreevy, and McAleese.
Okay, welcome everyone. We thought about what this audience would be, and you can't tell just from looking, but I think we were right in assuming there will be a number of people here who know a fair amount about this topic, and that seems to be the case because some of you are authors of books related to Catholicism, democracy, and related topics. And then we thought there would be some students or faculty or staff or others who are a little bit less familiar with some of the nuances of the conversation. So we're going to structure this conversation around 3 themes. And the first theme is a little bit of, let's all get up to speed on some of the basic issues on this big topic of Catholicism and democracy. So the first theme is that, which is the tortured historical relationship between the Catholic Church and liberal democracy. We'll spend a little time on that. And then second is the role of the church in navigating the contemporary landscape of liberal democracies under siege and illiberal democracies, or just downright authoritarian states, which seem to be on the rise. And then last but not least, our third section will turn to the church and focus a little bit more on the church in its own future as it moves into this geopolitical and cultural space, even as it's dealing with its own internal crises and global transformations. What do we look forward to? What can we say about the coming years and even decades? So part 1, the church and liberal democracy up to Pope Francis. I have a quote to start this part from Pope Gregory VI in Mirari Vos, August 15th, 1832, who castigated, quote, this most putrid font of indifferentism, that is, making decisions without the guidance of Holy Mother Church, from which flows, quote, that absurd and erroneous view, or rather insanity, that liberty of conscience should be asserted and claimed for just about everyone, close quote. So that was a kind of famous condemnation of the idea of religious freedom or religious liberty. That is, that you are free, you have a conscience, you're free to choose your own belief and your own religion. It was condemned as really kind of outright madness in Mirari Vos, 1832. So we're going to begin with John McGreevy. John, as many people here know, you've written a good deal about this topic of Catholicism and democracy, especially in a book devoted to that topic, one of your very great books, Catholicism and American Freedom. But also in John's recent book that you're all familiar with because he insisted that everyone be given one to buy. So I'm sure you've all been required, this is his role as provost, to buy one. So that's great, really a masterful survey of Catholicism from the French Revolution to Pope Francis. So, big wind up to your question. It is a tortured relationship, beginning at least as early as Gregory XVI, and the real challenges of the church to democracy, the condemnation of democracy that was listed in the compilations in the Syllabus of Errors, to fast forward to the 20th century and the dalliance with fascism, to a shift in Vatican II and Pope John Paul II shift to civil society. This is a big history. There's a lot to it. And I've seen Provost McGreevy do this in the past many times. You have 5 to 6 minutes to summarize that history. Go.
First, it's great to be here. There are a lot of experts in this audience who know more about some of these individual topics than I do. But thanks to the Ansari Institute, thanks to Scott, and thanks to you, jump in with questions, comments when we have that opportunity. Okay, 5 minutes, Catholicism and democracy. Here's what you need to remember. I'm going to spend 1 minute on each era, 5 eras, to get us from 1789 to the present. I start in 1789. Why, Paul Coleman?
French Revolution.
French Revolution. I start in 1789. French Revolution, often seen as the modern beginning of the idea of democracy in the democratic era. Catholic reaction to that is twofold. What we remember in this period, roughly from 1789 to 1848, period 1. What we remember most vividly is the intense Catholic reaction against the French Revolution. That's what people who are in their 70s and 80s in this audience were taught as children, as the French Revolution being one of the great awful events of modernity. And there is some truth to that in the persecution of Catholics, but also other Christians, at the end phase of the French Revolution, the anti-clerical dimensions of it. That set the stage for a Catholic rejection of much of what was associated with democracy in this period from 1789 to 1848. At the same time, same period, Catholics were leaders in the movement to advance democracy, especially in Spain and Latin America. Latin America was the most democratic region of the world in the early 19th century. More democracies there than any other place in the world, and Catholics were leaders in developing those democracies. In Belgium, there was a very significant democracy started in 1830 and really under Catholic auspices. So two things going on in that first period between 1789 and 1848, a rejection of the French Revolution and its association with democracy, which is very powerful, and that's what Gregory XVI is referring to in Scott's quote, and real interest, Catholic interest, in establishing democratic governments. Period 2, 1848, 1939. 1848, 1939. In 1848, there are a series of revolutions across Europe, but also a little bit in Latin America, and they often take an anti-clerical, sometimes anti-Catholic dimension. Now, there were lots of Catholics also enthusiastic about these revolutions. It was a very complicated story. But nonetheless, there was often an anti-clerical, we're going to take over church property, we're going to expel priests and nuns, anti-Catholic dimension to some of those revolutions. Same time, a man named Pius IX becomes Pope, and the church moves very much in a direction away from the formal endorsement of democracy. In fact, democracy becomes kind of a bad word in many Catholic circles. If you think about Catholic social thought, which we talk a lot about at Notre Dame, in 1891, Rerum Novarum, sometimes the document that's seen as the origin of Catholic social thought, the word democracy is not mentioned. So a lot of, at the formal level, hostility to democracy. At the practical level, though, lots of enthusiasm. Catholics become involved in democracy as democracy expands around the world in the late 19th century. There's a Catholic political party in Germany. In much of the Anglophone world, Irish Catholics become experts at winning elections and getting their people elected to offices and building political machines. In the same year, 1928, Al Smith runs for president as a member of what party, Kathy Cummings? Democratic Party. And he is defeated in part because of anti-Catholic prejudice, but he's the nominee of one of the two major political parties. In that same year, a Catholic is elected prime minister in Australia. Both are descendants of Irish Catholic immigrants to those countries. So formally, democracy is kind of a bad word. We don't really have an association with democracy. It doesn't become part of Catholic social thought. Practically, a lot of Catholics are involved in democratic politics where democratic politics exist. The only wrinkle in this second period, from 1848 to 1939, is that, like our own era, as democracies collapse between 1919 and 1939, across Europe and Latin America, something like 25 democracies become authoritarian governments. And a lot of Catholics are attracted to some of those authoritarian governments, especially in Portugal, Austria, Brazil, other places. The idea becomes widespread that you could have a Catholic government and you don't really need democracy. You know, you can have authoritarian rule and you can still kind of inhabit the world of Catholic social thought. Period 3, 1939 to 1965. The big event here is the Second World War, which eliminates, because of fascist governments being, of course, the opponents of the Allies during the war, the idea that there could be any kind of mix at the formal level between Catholics and authoritarian governments. The hero, in a way, of this last book I wrote is this guy named Jacques Maritain, who spent a lot of time at Notre Dame. And Maritain spends the bulk of the 1940s and 1950s making what he calls a Catholic case for democracy. That is, democracy is not just a system over there that maybe we can tolerate but not approve at the formal level. No, it's a system that Catholics should endorse because it's biblical and it's consonant with Catholic social teaching. And in a way, Maritain wins. There's this great period between 45 and 65 of what are called Christian democratic parties. Now, they weren't just Catholics who were supporting those parties, but it was mostly Catholics. And in West Germany and in Belgium and in the Netherlands and in Uganda and Indonesia, there are Christian democratic parties that say, we are going to blend Catholic social thought, respect for workers, health insurance, a whole range of policies, along with support for democracy. That was new. And that was one of the big developments of 20th century politics. And it culminates in the Second Vatican Council when Maritain has real influence on the last document of the council called Gaudium et Spes, where there are a couple of paragraphs more or less endorsing democracy. So that's the third period, from 39 to 65, culminating in a kind of triumph for the idea of Catholics and an alliance with democracy. And the fourth period, from 65 to 89, you see that in action. You see Catholics working for democracy in the Philippines and playing a crucial role in the movement, the collapse of the Marcos regime. You see, probably most importantly, Catholics in Poland playing through the Solidarity movement, and John Paul II playing a crucial role in the end of communism in the period up until 1989. You see Catholics in Spain assuring that there will be a democratic transition in Spain after the end of the old Catholic-style regime in Franco. You see Catholics in South Korea, where they're only 10% of the population, play a crucial role in the movement from dictatorship to democracy in South Korea. So South Korea, Philippines, Poland, Spain, you see people inspired by the Second Vatican Council and this idea of Catholics being allied with democratic movements, leading to real powerful social change. Then the fifth and final period, I would say, is from 1989 to where we are now. And of course, we don't know the outcome of that. But we're in a period of democratic retreat. We're in a period where the movement in civil society between 65 and 89 for Catholics to try and move toward democratic change is much weakened. We could talk about the American bishops in the current context and a lot of different things there. And we don't know how that will turn out, but we'll leave that to the next phase of the questions.
Great. Thanks, John. That provides a great overview. And now, Mary, let's talk about the period during our lifetimes.
Mhm.
And we've all experienced it up here and many in the audience, but you have not only experienced it, you've been a player because you've come to us with theological training, with canon law training, with your own knowledge of this history, and with your own experience first as a Catholic growing up in Northern Ireland, and then someone who came to lead Ireland, and of course, working closely with the church on that conflict and that situation. But you've also, in your engagement with the church in Rome, you've seen firsthand from a political lens and a Catholic lens, how the church is actually interacting in our lifetimes in some of the important matters of Catholicism, supporting democratic regimes or overturning, in the case of solidarity. So reflect with us, if you would. You've got as much time as John did. He came close to meeting my deadline. I just want to remind him because sometimes he thinks I talk a little bit too much. But nonetheless, you've got about the same length of time to reflect for us with that.
Well, as John took us back to the first period of 1789, and forgive me for starting there because I know you want to talk about the modern time, but actually it's not possible to dissect that historic connection. Talking about Ireland and listening actually as you have taken us through that, I'm very conscious of the difference between what was happening in Ireland and elsewhere. In 1789, the forces that were essentially in favor of the autonomy of the human person, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and freedom from the clasp and the grip of the empire that was religion. That actually appealed strongly to the Irish people, believe it or not, because shortly after, in 1798, we had our own revolution, our Irish Revolution, and that revolution was promoted by Protestants, Catholics, and dissenters. The Protestants being from the Anglican tradition, the dissenters being from the other Protestant churches, Methodism, Presbyterianism, and they worked together. What were they contradicting? What were they fighting against? They were fighting against empire. And the empire they were fighting about was a political empire, but it was also a religious empire. In fact, the Protestants who led that revolution were largely Presbyterians who, like Catholics at that time, were politically excluded. This was the era that gave birth to one of the great friends of Notre Dame in in today's world, Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell, the great, we call him the liberator. We call our main street in Ireland after him, O'Connell Street. You run O'Connell House in Dublin, also in his name. Often forgotten that he who championed Catholic emancipation, championed Presbyterian emancipation, Russian Jew emancipation, American African slave emancipation. He was essentially that first powerful voice. And he had been in France when the revolution started in 1789. And so he didn't like the violent part, but everything else he liked. He liked the idea of the autonomy of the human person, the dignity of the human person. And I would like to think that as we bounced into the 20th century, and Ireland had in 1848 another revolution from the same group, core group, designed to extricate us from what was a politico-religious empire. That was the empire of British imperialism, strongly linked to the Anglican Church also. So that infuses our thinking. You wouldn't find the same anti-clericalism that you found perhaps in France in the Irish experience. Then, of course, we had the great interruption of the famine, where half our population either dies or disappears, most of it to America. And we go into a period of extraordinary decline. And in that extraordinary decline, the Catholic Church becomes, if you like, a kind of a spine of determination to ride out both the poverty and the oppression that people were experiencing under the colonial forces, the forces of the British Empire. Then we have our next revolution in 1916. And out of that, then we have a partitioned island. In 1921-22, our island is divided along classical sectarian lines. In the north, where I grew up, the Protestant population, 66%, they own the government, they own the jobs, they own the housing, they own the power, and they're determined to exclude Catholics. Why? Because this state was founded to be a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people. It would call itself, even today, a democracy. God help us. So that's what I grew up with.
Yeah.
And I also grew up happily, and something that we talked about earlier today, at a time when the best way of describing it is from Seamus Heaney's poem, where he describes Catholics growing up in that era as living under high banked clouds of resignation, extraordinary passivity, believing that nothing would ever change. In the poem, it talks about, not in our lifetime would they ever experience the change that would give them the human dignity they believe themselves to own, if you like. Now, the Catholic Church played a good part in helping to press for the social changes that eventually led, for example, to the Good Friday Agreement. And you were right that quite a number of very distinguished Catholics led that. I mean, the great champion was a man called John Hume. John Hume was a classic example of what Seamus Heaney writes about in his poem From the Canton of Expectation. A young man who grew up in rural Ireland, where the expectation was that you would, your life would be while away your life against the flanks of milking cows, and suddenly this change of mood. What changed the mood? It was a change of era brought about by the massification of free second-level education that led to the massification of third-level education. Now you had the genius of confidence in education, and that gave us something very special. Catholics knew we couldn't get jobs, we couldn't get housing, we were always whinging about it and complaining about it, but actually doing anything about it was a frightful thing because nobody wanted to go back to violence, really, even though there was always a strong leitmotif of paramilitarism. Meanwhile, in the Republic, you had a Catholic state that was dominated by the Catholic Church. Even today, 90% of all our first level schools are Catholic schools. But what has changed there in the meantime, from 90% Catholics signing off on the census to say they're Catholics, we're now down somewhere closer to 60 to 70%. So a huge change there. So we are in a state of catharsis. Democracy has grown and flourished in the Republic. It's now a strong liberal democracy that has prized, actually, the Catholic Church, the clericalized Catholic Church, the hand of clericalism, which said you were baptized into the church because when you were baptized, you made promises. Because of those promises, you must obey the magisterium, and obedience became everything, rather than we'd like to persuade you to internalize into your heart and soul the message of the Christian gospel. No, we were told you must. An educated Catholic population now doesn't sit well with an educated Catholic population. But meanwhile, in the North, who led the impulse for democratic change was a wonderful Irishman called John Hume, who had been in Catholic seminary, going on for priesthood, and then had abandoned those after, I think, 5 or 6 years, but raised in the tradition of rerum novarum, the strength of Catholic social teaching, but also raised at the end of the Second World War, where Europe, which incidentally was a war that we would, on the one hand, say that the Irish government did not take part in. We didn't have a war, we had an emergency. And we were neutral during that war. And we've tended to downplay the fact that almost 250,000 Irish men volunteered to join the British Army and fought in, Gallipoli, Flanders, the Somme. 50,000 of them died. We've forgotten that story and that narrative conveniently. But now we are in a state where those narratives, with the benefit of education, are being brought back into public consciousness. And honestly, they've all helped us to move towards a greater understanding of what democracy means. Meanwhile, we had a civil war. I grew up in Belfast as a Catholic, relying on the church to be my hope and my consolation during a time when Catholics, now educated, were able to use the social sciences to measure, and this was the great change. We measured jobs, we measured housing, we measured the number of Catholics in X, Y, and Z jobs, and now we had the evidence. And the evidence helped to propel us towards greater democratization, but based on concepts like equality. Where did we get those from? They came to us directly from that great debate that took place in the aftermath of the Second World War, which gave us the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first time in human history that anybody sat down and wrote out the natural rights of the human person. Now, they didn't say these were God-given rights. They didn't use that. They used the expression natural rights. But those of us who believe in a God would simply take those words and say, well, these belong to us as of right as our God-given rights. Freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of opinion, freedom of religion, freedom to change religion. Catholic Church never adapted to that. Canon law said the opposite. It actually says emphatically that all those rights can be compromised by the teaching magisterium of the Church, which is why today I think we are on something of a state of chaos with regard to the role of the magisterium, in particular in the development of democracy. But as I look at Ireland and I look at Europe, what came out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? What came out of the Second World War, a war that was mainly fought in Europe? 70 million died. 4 great Catholic thinkers who came out of a straightforward Catholic European intellectual tradition sat down and said, in the name of God, we have to change the paradigm. We have to change the way we have to do better than this. What was the concept they came up with? What we now call the European Union. Where did the idea of totius Europe come from? The idea of all of Europe, French, Spanish, German, Irish, English. I don't remember, I can't mention them anymore. Where did that all come from? Where it came from was Ireland, from Columbanus. Why? Because we in Ireland, we remained outside the Roman Empire. We remained outside the Dark Ages. We stayed well out of all that. More by accident than design, as it happens. But when Columbanus came to Europe with a message to a warring Europe, and that war, the Dark Ages, unfortunately, the Christian churches had to take a big responsibility for that. But Ireland wasn't part of that. It was part of a pushback from that said, we want to honor the world of Aristotle as much as we want to honor the world of the Christian gospel. And then he said, back in the 5th, 6th century, to the warring factions, in the name of God, look, you can be Irish, you can be German, you can be Greek, you can be all those things. But if you work together rather than killing each other, you will create a so much better world, peace and prosperity. And we have that Columbanus tradition now actually flourishing in the European Union, but the pushback against it is always there. That's something I learned late in life. I thought it would always be a straight line towards democracy. I thought with the European, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with all our now rights-based agenda and all our pillars, the treaties of Rome, that it would be on a straight road, not realizing, in fact, the grip, the power of, if you like, the grip and the power of hatred is so much easier to sell than love, apparently. And so I grew up where Christians hated each other, and we had 4,000 people murdered on my doorstep. My parish was the worst place in Northern Ireland for sectarian deaths, bar none. My family impacted by it. People walked into our home and machine gunned us out of our home. My husband's family, they walked in, they took the picture of the Sacred Heart off the wall, they trampled on it and put them out of their home. That was normative. And so where was the Catholic Church in all of that? Well, on the one hand, it was a champion of change for Catholics. And then I began to realize it was a champion of change for Catholic men. It was not a champion of change for Catholic women. The light bulb moment went off for me when our parish priest, who was a great, he had every statistic that you could think of that would embarrass the Protestant government into realizing it was not a proper democracy, but actually was a theocracy. He had all those, the number of Catholics that couldn't get jobs, the number of Catholics that couldn't get houses. And then he walked into our home one evening. My mother was just out of hospital. After her 11th pregnancy, she'd almost died and she needed a hysterectomy. Our Catholic doctor said, no, you can't have it. But I'll organize for you to go to a Protestant doctor, which she did. She came out of the Protestant hospital, actually a state hospital, home, having had her life saved. And our parish priest walked in and reprimanded her in front of us children. I was the oldest, and said, you're 30, she was 38 years of age, incidentally. You're 38 years of age, you're still of childbearing age, you had no business having a hysterectomy, and you had no business having it without my permission. Whoa. That was the Catholic Church then in the Ireland. So I grew up with that, all that mix of chaotic thinking around the church and democracy. And I see it at work. I saw it at work with Francoism during the time of the Spanish Civil War. Half of Ireland, half of those who went to Spain went to fight for Franco, and the other half went to the International Brigade. I grew up with the International Brigade because the last living member of the International Brigade who could not get a job anywhere else in Northern Ireland, my father gave him a job. So I've got a skeptical, I would say, maybe more than skeptical, maybe a jaundiced view of the church's role in the promulgation of democracy. I'm proud of what it's done in terms of Catholic social teaching. I'm also very conscious that every single encyclical written by Leo XIII up until the wonderful Rerum Novarum, every one of them could have been written by Pius IX or Clement. Easily. They were dreadful documents.
Okay, let me
hostile to democracy.
Let me push pause there for a moment. I hate to leave the rich nuance of the story of Ireland, and we might come back to it, but thanks for that. It was very nuanced, and let's step back for a second. Mary, you put on the table a lot of rich ideas, one of which is there's so many ingredients in the Catholic contributions, negative and positive. We mentioned the restrictions of canon law, a historical legacy that's not friendly always to democracy, certainly not to women, and then Catholic social thought. Let's take a moment to look beyond just Ireland over the last 25, 30 years and the church's agency and its complexity around some of those elements. So I really want to test this question with you both and let John jump in first on some other cases, comparative cases. And the question is, Catholic social teaching is still an evolving body of teaching. Are the seeds there and the principles in place that continue to be a resource for supporting liberal democracy around the world? And have we seen that active in the last 30, 40 years in a way? And what's been the countervailing trends within the church itself? So talk about Philippines, Poland, whatever, but let's talk about some other cases and the way this really internally plural Catholic Church with various different points of emphasis, some seem to be anti-democratic, but others which seem to feed into the rights and the liberties and the solidarities that would. So it's a mixed record, but let's talk a little bit specifically about some cases. John, pick a case or two and look at the complicated. And remember one other thing, we're talking about the church at various levels. You didn't say quite as much, Mary, and maybe it's not appropriate by the Vatican as such. So we've got the International Catholic Church. We've got local actors in the local churches and then bishops. So you've got a multi-layered, still say in the Peace Building Institute and Peace Building, one thing about Catholicism, we brought John Paul Letterock and other people not as familiar with the Catholic Church originally. And they said, this is great because Catholicism is present for the good at the very top of the international church, at the national level and at the local level. And so we can work on all these levels. To recruit them here, we didn't tell them all those levels disagree and fight with each other. So let's talk about that, a little bit of the complexity of the multi-layered interventions and presences of the church in 2 or 3 other cases where democracy, for pro or con, we could talk about Hungary, whatever, so I'm going to ask you to get us going on that.
Mostly, I think the story since 1989 is one of Catholicism being a little bit more associated with democratic retreat than you would have predicted in 1989, where there seemed like like I said just a second ago, there's this moment of triumph where Catholicism is integral to the revolution in South Korea. It's integral to what goes on in the Philippines. It's integral to the transition in Spain. It's integral to the collapse of communism. It's not the only reason communism collapses, but it's integral to it in Poland. And then since then, just a much more complicated picture. I think you could look at Poland and Hungary as one sort of example where some parts of Catholicism are allied with, certainly in Hungary, what is an authoritarian government. Right. Poland is a very complex story, which I don't claim to have a full handle on. And there are Catholics on all sides of the debate within Poland, and issues around abortion become very central to that conversation. But there's a kind of authoritarian, illiberal democracy that you could associate there. If you went to Francophone West Africa, you'd have a very different view. It's a striking thing that 4 or 5 of the countries that become independent in Francophone West Africa in the 1960s, 1970s, even 1980s, I mean, they're already independent, but they have devout Catholics as leaders, and devout Catholics who claim that some of their worldview comes from the Second Vatican Council and the idea that religion and politics can be combined in fruitful ways. So those are almost 2 polar examples of where it plays out quite differently. So there's not one single story, but if there was the story I think you can tell from 45 to 89 is broadly one of modernization and triumph in that relationship of Catholicism and democracy. The story from 89 to the present is just much more complicated, and there are very discouraging and also very exhilarating moments.
Yeah, I take 2 examples. One, and you pinpointed 89. In 1989 was the year of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that convention owed a lot to a particular Catholic, but also to a group of Catholics. One of the great authors of it was Canon Joe Merman, a Belgian, who had promoted the idea of a convention that would give, if you like, autonomous citizenship to children. And it was a very radical document, still is. Catholic Church was deeply involved in drafting the Travaux Préparatoires all during the 1980s. It was the Holy See was, because of course it has permanent representative status at the United Nations, the only faith system to have it, it became a signatory and a ratifier of that document and was the 4th such place to do it. I'm very conscious that I'm sitting in the only country in the world that has not ratified that. It has signed but not ratified that convention. And this was a really extraordinary movement, a whole change of gear in relation to children that the Catholic Church was behind. I look at what, and it was John Paul, St. John Paul, who signed off on that document and was very flattering about it. Today, the Church is a complete, almost a pariah with regard to that convention, because it has fought with the Committee of the Rights of the Child. It has told the Committee on the Rights of the Child things that, let me put it politely, were wrong, quite remarkably wrong. It has misled the committee. It has accused the committee of being driven by a gay mafia, completely just nonsensical, and has pitched itself now in opposition to the very thing that in 1989 it was lauding and applauding. And so that's one thing, and that really mirrors what you're saying, John, about the pushback and the conservatism. But the second thing I would say is the Synod on Synodality has revealed a massive, massive area of, if you like, disconnect between the magisterium of the Church and the magma of the Church. The magma is the huge, massive groundswell of the faithful on 5 continents who've been quietly talking about among themselves since the Second Vatican Council, all the way through, whether it's democratization, whether it is the advent of and the benefiting from 2nd-level education and 3rd-level education, the confidence that comes from that, having new critiquing skills. And now that magma that never got the chance before, because the Church never offered a place where those people's voices could be heard. It was a top-down autocratic system that said, here's what the magisterium teaches. You pledge to obey, you pledged as baptized Catholics to obey it, and that is your responsibility, your duty is to obey. That discussion has now changed quite radically, because as the voices of the faithful who took part in the synodal process have emerged, we have heard and seen really radical ideas across those 5 continents with remarkable consensus, particularly, for example, around the inclusion of women, particularly around human sexuality, particularly around LGBTIQ issues, around governance in the church. So much so that it used to be that when you challenged the autocracy of the church, you were always told, including by Francis himself, the church is not a democracy. And that was supposed to end the conversation. And what has now come back is the voice of the people through that magma that's broken up through the surface in this volcanic explosion of debate, saying, well, why not? Why wouldn't we democratize our processes? How well has autocracy served us? When we look at the numbers who are fleeing the church, who are turning around and walking away from the church, not just the Catholic Church, but also all Christian churches. I don't know if you noticed the Scottish church, the Church of Scotland, which I've worked in Scotland over the last number of years now, but kind of increasing fondness and respect for the Church of Scotland, just announced a couple of weeks ago they're planning to close 600 churches. It's a very small jurisdiction, 600 churches. Because they haven't the money, it's tailing off. So in Ireland, just this week, the Catholic bishops announced the end of the big publishing company they've had called Veritas, the publisher of Catholic texts, will be closing at the end of this year. So there's been a retreat, all right, but it's been a retreat into liberalism, ironically, by the people who constitute the faithful. And the church has lost out on that because, as John has said quite rightly, focusing on issues like abortion, focusing on issues like same-sex marriage, and being the opponents of that, while, for example, in Ireland, the major proponents of that have been people who were educated Catholic.
I was going to say earlier that I asked this question. Now let me revise it based on what you just said. I was going to ask, can we imagine a John Hume today, coming up today? If we take 89 as a turning point, and the various crises within the church, the kind of dysfunction and the sexual abuse scandal. I had a very interesting conversation with a leading Irish intellectual and historian a few months ago, and he kept referring to himself as an atheist. And as I was talking to him, I thought, you don't sound like an atheist. He said, the only reason I'm an atheist is because the Catholic Church told me to believe in God. and in other words, that's a nice code for the backlash and the declension, not just in Ireland, of the institutional church. And could a Hume come from that setting? The answer would seem to be it's very hard to imagine someone inspired by Catholic social teaching, someone who understands the trajectory and is working in a positive way. So that was going to be my question. Maybe it's hard to imagine that happening, but what do you see going forward? You've just given us hope with the magma, the rising, and the insistence, but there's still the institution, and there's still a lot of countervailing trends. How do we think about the church with its own internal questions of quote unquote democracy, and how that might connect to a more effective voice in batting back illiberal democracies and supporting democracies going forward?
Actually, yeah, I'm never without hope. I'm never without hope, and I'm also never without faith in the possibility, the potential of the Catholic Church to be what I think Christ intended his church to be, which would be a leaven in the world for the spiritual values and principles of love, forgiveness, tolerance, respect, equality, all of those wonderful concepts that I think we are only now, in my generation, beginning to grow into. We're beginning to grow into them at a time when the world is threatened with its own extinction. And I'm very conscious that a new generation is growing up possibly without that hope. So, which is why I feel a real sense of responsibility to continue to hold on to it and to fight for it, and to fight internally in the church to say to the church, please take the issue of our human rights seriously. Take the idea of equality seriously. Stop dismissing the democratic instincts and understand that they have the potential to turn the church into something wonderful, much more wonderful than it is. Let me give you an example of the worry I have. I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with my 7-year-old grandson, and who will turn 8 in 2 weeks' time. And I said to him, are you excited about being 8? And he said, why should I be? And I said, well, I thought you might like the idea, turning 8. And his answer really bothered me. He said, it's just a year nearer death.
Wow.
But actually, when we analyzed it, what's he absorbing from the world? Climate change, the dangers that the world is going to implode by its own action and inaction, the nuclear button, Moscow, Kiev, the disaster of the Middle East. And he's looking at the place where Christ walked that hallowed ground, And if ever there's a failure of Christianity, boy, it's evident there. If ever there's a failure of Christianity, it was evident in my own country, until we got to 25 years ago, the Good Friday Agreement, right? And everybody would have said, thanks to God, thanks for people like George Mitchell, thanks for people like Bill Clinton, who hung in there and created a kind of just a duvet, a comfort blanket that never left us, and insisted that they would be with us. And what brought these radically opposed, hate-filled sides together, funnily enough, were those words, because we'd all grown up with them. We'd all done the nativity stories. We'd all heard about the Prince of Peace. We'd all sung the beautiful Christmas carols that fill us, with joy and with hope. And ironically, we all came out of those traditions, even though we were Protestant and Catholic and atheist, but we came out of those, and somehow those words provided enough glue to give us the opportunity to project us into a dispensation, a compromise that gave us the Good Friday Agreement. Now, having said that, it's 25 years old, and for most of that time, it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. If at one level it hasn't worked, because the shared government was abandoned for half of that time. And yet, we have an international agreement with all the right words in it, the right language in it. And somehow it's been enough to hold us back from retreating to violence. Why? Because of the magma. Because this was the will of the people. We put it to a referendum, north and south, and overwhelmingly, this is what the people wanted. They wanted to be friends. They wanted to share all those lovely values. And they didn't want the politics of politicians, the language of binary, the language of hatred, the language of oppression and winning. They wanted winners and losers. The politicians who wanted winners and losers were, I think, humbled to realize that the people didn't want that. They were content with winners and winners. They were content with a situation where if you hold out for 100% winning, you can end up with 100% of nothing. But 90% of something is a hell of a lot more valuable than 100% of nothing. So I think we're in a state of huge, exciting transition, but the price we pay for it is pushback.
Very good. Okay, we want to leave some time. The time has gone quickly, at least from my perspective. And we want to leave time for you to make a few comments and ask questions. Before we do, Professor McGreevy is going to summarize this conversation. He's got 3 minutes to raise any salient points, since you haven't.
Okay, 3 minutes, one story.
One story.
Okay.
Which kind of works a little bit against. I mean, I want to be on Mary McAleese's team, in terms of new leaders and hope for the future. I don't know if it works against it or not, but 2 weeks ago I was in Rome, and I was at a panel of what we call young Catholics. And they had eight people lined up on the stage from truly all over the world. Rome is just an amazingly global Catholic city. It's astonishing. And the question was asked of these 8 young Catholics, if you had 15 minutes alone with Pope Francis, what would you ask? And their answers were interesting. There was a women religious nun from Nigeria who said, I wish he would stop talking about same-sex blessings. It's too controversial in Nigeria. It's not what we should be talking about. I wish he would stop. The man from Singapore said, I wish he would talk more about the environment. I know he's a leader on the environment, but it is just the issue in Singapore for Catholics. The woman from Hong Kong said, I wish that the Vatican would tell us the details about the Vatican's treaty with China, because there is a real fear for religious liberty in Hong Kong. Catholics feel very nervous about the Chinese state, and that's what we care about, etc. The man from Brazil said, we have to integrate women into leadership in the church. That is the #1 issue. So the range of answers to an open question at a closed forum where people could be very honest just reminded me of how hard a job Pope Francis has. And man, it's 1.2 billion baptized people, and holding together all those cross currents in some way is really a challenge. I think the Synod on Synodality, which is hard to say, is the best effort since the 1960s to try and capture those cross currents. But I don't think it's all moving in one direction. I think there's the woman religious from Nigeria who was exceptionally articulate and smart, multiple theological degrees. She couldn't have been more passionate about stop talking about same-sex blessings, even to an audience that I think was very sympathetic to the idea of same-sex blessings. So it's just worth registering that complexity.
Thank you. Okay, we've got, I think we have about 15 minutes or so for conversation. I am going to now crack the whip, having let my colleagues talk as long as they want. They're going to be very succinct in whatever they say in response. And I ask you to do us the same favor. Don't make speeches, make a comment or a question. I think you have the mic, please.
Oh, I've got to speak. Take care.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're gonna see.
Thank you for this stimulating discussion. I'd like to ask...
Tony, would you introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, my name is Tony Annette. I am the author of Cathonomics, How Catholic Tradition Can Create a Just Economy, which we'll be discussing tomorrow. But tonight, I want to ask about, I'm noticing this trend among younger Catholics towards what they call post-liberalism or even integralism, which seems insane to me. But it seems to be growing in popularity, and it seems to be almost trying to wipe out the Second Vatican Council. So do you think this is a real issue, or this is just fringe noise that can be ignored?
Why don't we are there other questions, people waiting? If not, we'll go ahead and, do you have one? Go ahead. Why don't we take a couple and then the panelists can respond.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Wong, and I focus on Chinese Catholicism. You mentioned a couple times the collapse of communism, and I was just wondering if you could speak to Vietnam and the South Korea and mainland China, as opposed to, say, the Hong Kong case, where it's not obvious that communism collapsed and people are looking to express a Catholic faith that maybe isn't necessarily democratic. Where does that fit into the conversation?
Anyone else? One final one at this round? Okay. Why don't we start with integralism? Either one of you want to take that?
Catholic Church, 1.3 billion people worldwide. 1.3 billion people stretched across 5 continents, living through the cathartic times when I mentioned the power of education, which is transformed and has been transformative. So honestly, 1.3 billion different voices. And I think one of the strengths of the church that is emerging and is surprising to me, because with the autocratic control and the magisterial control, the fear would have been that as you challenge that magisterial control, and as it weakened, and of course it's been deeply weakened by clerical child sex abuse scandal, in particular the Episcopal cover-ups, you would have thought that there would be an opportunity, and as people move away in large numbers from the church, that you would find the bunkerization or the siloization of the church, and the breakup of communion. But I actually think that that's not the case, that even the trends that you're talking about, which are only marginally evident in Ireland, marginally, because the vast bulk of Catholics now are on the side of same-sex marriage, abortion rights, and all of the rest of it. So on the liberal side, you may say, I think actually we're moving into a phase of becoming more comfortable with the reality that our church is so broad, so big, and so vocal, and so noisy, and so boisterous, that we're now finding our way, I think, a pathway through to what will eventually be very considerably reformed, not just magisterial teaching, but a different type of magisterium. Now, we're only at the beginning of this, and there is something quite frightening for some people in that, who want to hold on to the old magisterial certainties, but actually they're evaporating. You asked actually earlier, would there be people, could we see a John Hume? I already see loads of them around the place, but I actually see them, funnily enough, even in the council, even among the cardinals. I think someone like Cardinal Hollerich, McElroy, Cupich, Grech, Scicluna. These are people, not too many in Ireland, unfortunately, but maybe one in Ireland. I remember writing to the papers after, in 2021, when the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith said that God could never bless sin, therefore they never, ever, in perpetuity, could there ever be a blessing for a same-sex married Catholic couple. I wrote, the language was dreadful. Catholic, such people, according to that document, they were incapable of expressing or receiving God's grace. Imagine. And I was appalled by the language. I thought it was appalling. So I wrote a letter to the paper and I said, is there one bishop, just one, who is willing to say that this is awful language? This is not the language of a loving God. Because the Germans were saying it, the Belgians were very courageous. And just one. Just one. But, you know, one's a start.
Good.
One's a start.
Take the Asian
On
question.
integralism, I think it's not a popular movement. This is the idea of a kind of authoritarian Catholicism, in some ways echoing the 1930s. I don't think it's a popular movement at all. But there is a segment of really, I think, American intellectuals more than any other place. That's what's interesting. That seems to be drifting in that direction. And that amazes me. I never would have predicted that. On China, you know a lot more than I do. I just think we need so much more research and study of Chinese Catholicism, what that actually is. One thing I would add, in Hong Kong, a lot of the leaders of the pro-democracy movement are Catholic. I don't know how much they attribute it to their Catholic formation, but it's striking. Many of them came out of Catholic schools. Jimmy Lai, others, other famous people within that movement fighting for democracy do so for Catholic reasons. So it's just worth noting.
Other comments, questions?
Thank all three of you. My name is Dom. I work with students here. Very briefly, I wonder, are you more optimistic or sort of mixed or pessimistic about the capacity for the Catholic imagination and our imagination about democracy always roiling and mixing together to be generative in an era of emergently, rapidly changing technology? I think of myself, I'm a 29-year-old from the Chicagoland outskirts in the dissolution of the subculture. Am I more likely to encounter the Catholic imagination through something like Alice McDermott's sterling new novel, Absolution? Or am I more likely to find it in a fragment on Twitter, right? So I guess my question is, in this emergent era, how do you see imagination playing out in places like social media, AI?
Can I simply say about the fears about artificial intelligence make me laugh, because most of my life I've lived with superficial intelligence. And it's been, honestly, infinitely more dangerous. And so I'm not worried. I'm genuinely not worried. I think it could be a great ally. And I think the social media can also be a great ally in connecting those of us around the world, it can, who really want to be part of generating hope. In the same way that same social media can generate anger and hatred and revulsion and stigmatization and stereotype, but we can fight those battles in that place. So I'm not too worried. I think what I am worried about, and I'm looking now at Ireland, but I'm also looking at Rome. You know, I lived and studied in Rome for many years, so spend a lot of my time there. And I see a magisterium still that is not connected to the kind of things that my children are talking about. Completely disconnected, does not want to engage with the downstream, the normative downstream consequences of, for example, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Does not want to engage with United Nations bodies in discussions about what religious freedom means, what freedom of conscience means, freedom of opinion means. We still are living out that, I think the magisterium, regrettably, is still living in that old autocratic hierarchical system where when the magisterium speaks, the rest of us are supposed to stay silent and simply accept, passively accept. And that day, for the magisterium, I have to say, in all honesty, living in Rome and living in a seminary in Rome, as I have done for quite a number of years, I have found a strong, at two levels, a resistance to the democratization and the impulse towards the autonomy of the human person and the acceptance of their human rights, in particular equality, the equality agenda, which impacts particularly women and LGBTIQ. I find strong resistance to that. And that bothers me because I'm talking to and working with, not working with, but living with a lot of young people, insofar as there's a lot of any young people still associated with the church in Rome. The truth of the matter is, I mean, in Ireland, we used to have 40 seminaries. Now we've one, and we can't keep it open. So that's the backdrop there is, it's fallen off a cliff, but I'm not getting the sense of that in Rome. I'm just not getting it there. It's almost like, you know, they're living in some other bubble. And to break out of that bubble, I'm looking at it saying, you've got to help me. You want me to hand my faith on to my own children? In God's name, help me. Because everything you're doing is the opposite. Everything you're doing and saying is cutting the umbilical cord. My mother said to me the other day, she's 93, she said, I'm wondering, will I get a Christian burial? And I said, why, what do you think we're going to do with you? But she said, I have 9 children. And she said, and I don't think any of them would know all the decades of the rosary. Anyway, right, okay. Look, Mother, I'll give you a guarantee now, honest to God, you know, we'll do our best. Honestly, we'll do our best to dignify you with a Catholic burial. And we'll give you that guarantee now. But here's a 93-year-old looking at the world and saying, she said she feels a failure because her children now, so many of them, challenge. She never thought to challenge the church. She never thought it was the right thing to do. And I think we are seeing just a huge disconnect. I don't think the magisterium has got the message. Now, unfortunately, I'm wrong about part of that because actually you're right. There are quite a number of people in Rome who do get the message. They are now people like Ulrich and Grech who are in positions of authority in the Synod. And I think their voice is being heard. And one of the reasons why the Pope backtracked so furiously on same-sex marriage blessings. And I've never in my life ever known a time when the Catholic Church has said one thing with such emphaticness, sorry for that abuse of the English language, but such emphasis. Actually, no, emphaticness gets it much more strongly. In 2021, the Church is not empowered to bless same-sex marriages or to offer blessings to same-sex couples. And then now suddenly we are. Suddenly we are, provided, of course, they're hole in the wall, take 15 seconds, have nothing to do with marriages, actual marriages. You can't wear wedding clothes, oh dear God. So, you know, just so hidebound in rules and rules and rules because we're brilliant at rules and we're overly legalistic. And until we walk away from that legalism, that rigid, and allow the grace of God to flood us with love and forgiveness and tolerance. And that's what I hope for. I just hope for that church. I still think it's possible.
Okay.
Not sure. What do you think? Will we? What do you think?
I don't know. My quick answer is just we're in a moment with the dissolution of the subculture in the North Atlantic. not
Yeah.
the rest of the world necessarily, but in the North Atlantic, where young people learn more about Catholicism from media than they do from the surrounding culture. That's new. Okay. And just as the social media revolution has had a very destabilizing effect on democracy, it's having a destabilizing effect on any institution, not just Catholicism, hoping to pass on traditions, culture, etc. True of other religious traditions as well. And I don't think anybody's figured that out.
Okay, the penultimate word goes to Professor Cummings. Rebecca, could you bring the microphone over here, since you should be up here on the panel anyway? What do you have to say, Kathy, about all this?
I would have liked a little bit of a warning, but it's okay. I'm just really glad we're having this conversation here at Notre Dame. And Mary, I just want to say we don't often hear the perspective of a woman who's been a leader, who is a leader, and who cares very deeply about the church, and has been, because of criticism of the church, people think that you don't love the church, or that you're not. I mean, I've experienced that. And there you are with your ashes on your forehead, and your faith is just such an inspiration, and also your challenge. And I think it's a challenge to all of us. So I think I'm just really grateful to hear that. John and Scott, you're great too, of course. But I think my takeaway is hope. I think we're so despairing right now, and I think that this conversation has given us a lot of directions to kind of think about hope. So I'm just really grateful to be here. Thank you.
I could not do a more eloquent closing than that one. So I want to thank Mary and John and all of you for being here, and we'll see you at the reception. Thank you. I misspoke. Wait a second. Sorry about that, Mahan. You have some announcements.
Just a few announcements before we head to the reception. So tonight's program is part of a series of events this week at the Ansari Institute. Tomorrow, in Jenkins Nanovic Hall's next door, we have a multi-faith symposium around this year's Nasser Book Prize winner. And you heard a question from the winner of that prize, Tony Anand, in the session. Scholars from the Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Chinese, Catholic, Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Baha'i, and secular and scientific traditions and perspectives will engage the award-winning book, Cathonomics: How Catholic Tradition Can Create a More Just Economy. That's going to be from 9:30 a.m. until 4 p.m. in the building next door. In the evening at 6 p.m., we will be here once again in this auditorium to award the Nasser Prize and for a keynote and roundtable discussion with the author, Anthony Annett. On Friday, over lunch, we are celebrating the newly published work of our colleague Rashid Omar on a Muslim response to COVID-19 based on his experience as an imam in Cape Town, South Africa. Scott Appleby will be part of that celebration, along with our distinguished guests and members of the advisory board, Anantaran Rambachan and Azza Karam. So the books, all of the books that have been mentioned are available for sale outside. And finally, as we head to the reception, on behalf of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, let me thank the many co-sponsors of tonight's program: the Notre Dame Forum, Kushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, the Center for Social Concerns, and the Kiev Naughton Institute for Irish Studies. Thank you to all of our partners. Thank you to our wonderful and distinguished panel. And now, enjoy the reception.